Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of this Nuke series about how to go about creating this shot. So we're going to talk about some different things than part 1. If you haven't seen the other parts, you can check out the trailer for this Nuke series and part 1. So those videos are on my channel. But yeah, so this one we're going to talk about primarily how to go about doing the cracks on the face in 2D, in 3D, and some of the tracking solutions we can use to kind of approach this, and also analyzing the shot before we approach it, so we know which tool to use in which situation. So before you start doing things, it's good to know to kind of have an idea and see the problem areas of your shot before you approach it. So that's kind of generally how I approach shots. Is I look at it, I try to figure out based on the motion, based on the angles, what's going to be the best thing in which area. So I'm not just going to start doing a 3D track overall. You don't want to be heavy-handed on one technique and then it turns out you're either using a technique that takes too long or you're using a technique that's not going to work. So you could do a certain type of track that would work for everything, but maybe it takes way longer. So part of it is about saving time. So that's something to think about. So yeah, basically part 2, we're going to talk about setting up before creative, so the tracking, blending 2D textures, 2.5D enhancements, so we're using some of the 3D mixed with 2D textures, using UV space for lighting, 3D enhancement, 3D ambient occlusion, displacement, and then creating crack mats. So I'll talk about what that is. So this is basically what you need to do. You can pause this video if you're actually doing this project, because this is a list of pretty much the order of how I would approach this if you're trying to do this project. So really, when you're doing this, you want to have your tracks all set up and then build out your cracks in this order. So I'm not going to re-explain this, but that's kind of the order of what you should do, and you'll be ready for part 3 of the series if you've already done all of these things. So yeah, we'll get into it. First thing I'm going to talk about is looking at this shot. So we'll just look at the original footage and sort of just play through. And I can just kind of scrub through real roughly. So one of the things I'm looking at when I'm looking at footage is how things move and when things, where things overlap. So if I take a roto paint, this is kind of what I briefly mentioned in the first video, but I just want to kind of point it out. So let's just get a color here. So one of the things that I'm looking at when I'm looking at this is this could either be a planar track, stuff like this could be planar track, but I wouldn't want to necessarily planar track here because we have warping. So the neck is going to be deforming, and deforming is not the best situation for a planar track. So immediately when I'm looking at the shot, I'm already thinking Smartvectors. If you do have Mocha, there's a new, I think it's a power mesh tracker that can do like deforming planar tracking basically, but I don't have a Mocha license, so basically I'm just working in Nuke. So Smartvector is going to be something that I'm looking at. So rather than doing a planar track and a Smartvector, this area would probably work as a Smartvector as well. So that's what I'm thinking. So when I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, well, this whole area, we already solved it with Smartvectors. Same for over here. Smartvector is going to work in most of this. And if we gain up, we can see where there's detail and where there's not. So there's a little bit of detail in hand. So Smartvector actually works for all of this area as well. The one area it doesn't work is basically this cloth, which I think I'll talk about in the next video because this is more when we're putting the effects on. But there is one area here that's kind of a problem area. And it's because there's all these, basically vertical lines with no tracking features. And the lighting is changing on it. So you can't really Smartvector that. And you'll see if you try to Smartvector it, you're going to get like warping and stuff like that. So basically what we're going to have to do in part 3 when we do the tracking for this area, you'll basically have to do a track here and a track here, and we'll just blend those two tracks together. So using ST maps, we can blend the motion of these two transformations and solve this entire area by combining and dissolving, basically rotoscoping those patterns together. So we can kind of mix tracks. And then the last thing and the biggest part of our shot is the face. So we could do some areas with Smartvectors on this. We could totally do Smartvectors in a lot of areas. The areas Smart Vector is not going to be great is where there are parallax and overlap. So you see here, we have that on the nose. So we have this area that's going to be revealed behind, and that's not going to be a great place for Smart Vectors. We also have the same kind of problem down here. We have some overlap, which wherever there's overlap, you're going to have issues with Smart Vector. If we draw this out, this is the overlap area where the chin is going to come across. So we see the chin's going to come this way. So really what you are going to want to do is Smart Vector and rotoscope off this moving overlapping object. So basically we would chop off this chin area, we would roto it off, and then we would Smart Vector everything below. So we would Smart Vector all of this stuff. And let me just erase all this now. So let me just explain this concept a little further. So if we Smart Vector down here, we rotoscope off the chin, and then the area that it overlaps, what we want to do is basically do an Inpaint. So an Inpaint node, we can kind of do, it's kind of like an edge extend. So we're kind of extending this Smart Vector track data, and we want to extend it past the point where there's overlap. So that's kind of what we're going to do for the tracking of that. And the same actually applies for areas that kind of fall off, like over here when there's like an edge that, you know, the Smart Vector doesn't know what to do on the very edge. It does a really great job in the center, but on the edges, you might see a little bit of warping. So we would track the inside like this, and then we would do kind of an Inpaint and kind of edge extend it outward. So the tracking data is going to basically come from the area that's working. And that's how you can kind of track areas that have those edge issues with Smart Vectors. And that's not something people really talk about a lot with Smart Vectors. But it is something that is really useful to know, that you can kind of do those type of things. One thing to know, if you aren't familiar with Smart Vectors, by the way, you know, you can just type in Smart Vectors on YouTube. You're going to find, I think the Foundry even has some tutorials, how to approach Smart Vectors and all that stuff. So if you guys don't know how to use that, my goal with the channel is not to sort of reinvent the wheel with tutorials that already exist. So you can go find that information. So that's how we would approach the tracking. So we're not going to use Smart Vectors on the face. We're going to use 3D. So that overlap problem won't be a factor, and we'll have the benefit of working in UV space by using a Keentools face tracker. So if you guys don't have Keentools for this project, it's okay. I'm providing the 3D track face so you can get some experience and see what it's like to work with a match moved head, basically. But they do have a free trial on their website. So if you want to learn how to use their software, I believe you can just download it for free. You can even try it out in this project and see the workflow. So that's basically how we'll approach the tracking of the shot. And then the other thing I want to say, I guess I'll just create a new row paint here. Just switch to a color. So one other thing is areas with parallax, we want to treat differently than areas that have no parallax, and that's just going to save us time. So I kind of briefly mentioned that as well in the first video, but so areas like here, this is kind of not completely intuitive, but if you're looking at it, you'll actually see it. So for example, here, we're looking at it pretty much straight on the whole time. There is obviously motion of this, but you know, like if I were to place a 3D crack here, you're not going to feel that much of a parallax difference. Whereas if we're looking more on like a glancing angle, like over on the side of the face, there's going to be more parallax on those areas. So that's where we would want to use 3D. So we would use 3D more in those areas. So we can actually, once we have the 3D model, we're going to take this area and essentially displace it outwards. So we're going to add actual depth to it. And same up here, so we can actually do some depth up here, and these areas you're going to actually feel it because there's more kind of rotation happening, whereas this is facing us more directly. So basically these areas will be like 2.5D, so we're kind of projecting onto a 3D model, so it's kind of 3D, but it's still using 2D textures. Whereas these areas are actually truly 3D because we're actually creating 3D geometry from 2D textures, which is basically the same thing as going into CG or Maya or something like that, except we're just doing it in Nuke. Same over here. We use 3D over here because we can actually really what you want is you want 3D cracks. So you kind of want to feel some slight edge breakup on the very edge, and you're going to feel the parallax a little bit more because it's kind of, you know, on the edge. So I didn't displace it that much. I didn't go like crazy with it if you look at the final comp, but we can get some very slight, you know, stuff like this, which gives it a little bit nicer quality. So that's kind of the way I'm breaking down the shot. And of course we have the rest of the down here, which is 2D. So this is all 2D solution. Yeah. So this is a very laggy roto paint, but yeah, there you go. So that's kind of breaking down the, at least the how to approach the shot. So again, I always do this. I don't draw it out, but I do think about this when I look at a shot. You know, I'll look at a shot, think about it, and try to figure out the best solution before I start just throwing solutions at it, because you don't want to waste time. And this working this way, not being heavy-handed and doing the same thing for everything, is going to save you lots of time. So that's the setup. Now we'll actually talk about, going about it. I'll show you what I did. I'll give you some tips on the Smartvector and the 3D track. There's already really extensive tutorials on Keentools face tracking, so I'll just briefly explain what I did with this and briefly explain the Smartvectors, because like I said, there's really a lot of information already exists. And if you're not familiar with these two things, you can find the information, and it's going to be a better tutorial than, you know, if they already have a 1 hour tutorial on Keentools, it's going to be very, very in depth. And this was actually my first project using this, so their information that they have is really great for that. So yeah, we can take a look at that now, and then we'll talk about more of the creative stuff in terms of the texturing of this face. All right, so now we're going to talk about the Keentools part here with facebuilder and facetracker. So for those of you who want to do the optional part of doing this part of the project, you can definitely go ahead and go to the website and get these. So basically the difference between facebuilder and facetracker, facebuilder will basically create the 3D model, and facetracker will stick it to your footage and track it. So it's really simple. But yeah, if you guys don't have that or you can't get it, we also have the 3D head provided, and you can at least see what it's like to work with a 3D tracked model, like I said. So we have that here, and that will be in the project file. There's actually a collection of nodes at the top that will kind of be given to you in a script. So that's pretty useful. But yeah, let's just briefly talk about what I did here. So basically I didn't have, so basically facebuilder, you can have multiple photographs of someone's face from different angles, and you can try to basically model a more accurate representation to the face, and that's what's really, this is really useful for. Now I didn't take the time and do that, but I did have you know, enough of a rotation in the shot that I can still work with something. So basically what I did was I frame holded the start of the shot, and I frame holded the end. So we have these two different angles that we can work from, which gives us a similar kind of working condition to taking pictures from different angles of the face. So basically all I did after that was I set the frame range of one of these to 170, and then I set another one to 171. So basically what I'm doing with this is I'm using the pen clip. And so now if I go between frame 170 and 171, they are one frame apart. And that's kind of what the face builder is wanting, is to have multiple frames in a sequence, one frame after the other, and then you can kind of build a face based on that. So that's why we're doing the append clip. And if you guys don't know this, if you don't know this node, you can think of it like DaVinci Resolve or something, where you put one clip after the other in a timeline. That's basically what it's doing. So we're kind of freezing this frame, putting it onto frame 170. We're kind of freezing this frame and then moving it onto frame 171, and then we're putting them right after each other. So now you see if I go from 170, 171, we can switch between. And then if you do a face builder node and you plug it in, you can plug it in here, and we'll go to the start frame. All right, and then basically we can just look here, hit align face, and boom, we already get a 3D model. So now what you can do is start to line this up a little bit more. So you can grab these pins, you can move them over and start to line up the edges. And so this is actually kind kind of deforming the model more accurately to the face. So if we were to look at this in 3D, that's kind of what it's doing. So some of the chin area as well, something I noticed is you want to grab some of these lower pieces and push them under, and then kind of pull the chin down so that you kind of get the pieces, you know, the shape of the jawline. And that's kind of how I went about doing this. So I went around, look at different areas, make sure that they're kind of lined up. And also what's really great about this is facetracker can actually track expressions. So you can actually, you know, track eyelids and stuff like that. I didn't track the expressions on this project because I didn't need to. There's not that much motion going on. But if there's someone talking and stuff like that, you can actually move the expressions independently. You can actually open the mouth and move the eyelids and stuff like that, which is really, really cool, especially for moving stuff. So you see I went here, and then I would go to the next frame. Let's turn that. Go to the next frame. Align face. Make sure we go there. Yeah, let's try that again. Line face. All right, there we go. And then it's kind of lined up, and then we would need to move this over, make sure this is rotated behind. And essentially just go around and tweak it. So the more frames you have, the more accurate this model is going to be. So if you had 3 or 4 pictures, which is more how facebuilder I think is intended to be used, you could probably get a really, really accurate 3D model. In my case, I think I just used 2 frames, or maybe I used 3. But now if I switch between those 2 frames, you'll see that we're starting to get something closer. And then if it's off in some places, you can go back and tweak it and push these points around. And that's kind of how it works. So you see now it's getting closer, but yeah, sometimes you'll adjust it on the last frame. You'll need to go back and adjust it again. So it's really just a back and forth, and you just need to kind of tweak those settings and kind of line things up. So maybe the eyelids need to be lower. Maybe this needs to be wider. And so that's how I went about doing it. And it does take a little bit of time. You still need to have some patience, and just like any type of tracking, you know, it's not some instantaneous thing, but it is a very, very great tool to have. So after that, you basically will just plug it into a face tracker, and you can check out face tracker. And I think I started my shot later on in time. I didn't actually do from frame 200. But basically you go ahead and basically track it after that. And it's sort of like any other type of tracking. You have the track tools up here. You can go in, you can adjust the points, you can keyframe them across time. One thing I noticed is really the keyframes definitely help. So, you know, you want to set like a keyframe of a pin, go back in time, set another keyframe, and then you can refine the track between those 2 points. And if it's sliding, you work between those 2 points and adjust it. So that's how I basically went about using it. And that gives us the 3D model. So now we have the 3D model of the head, and we can do everything we can do, you know, with a 3D model. So this is our head geometry, and we have that tracked to our footage. That's being projected onto in this case. But yeah, so that's really, really awesome. And later on in part 3, I actually talk about using some of that head for interactive light as well. So I actually use, don't think I mentioned this, but let me just show you because it's kind of cool. So as the cracks appear, we can even use this 3D model to like cast light onto, which is going to give us like those little hints or pools of light on different facing angles of the face. So that would be really hard to achieve just, you know, doing it 2D. You're gonna have to do like roto shapes or something. But as the cracks are expanding, I used 3D lights moving with them. So it kind of creates this more realistic effect, which is, let's just go here. Yeah, so you can see it's subtle, but it gives us, you know, all those subtle little layers. You see the nose starts to light up as the cracks are coming, and the cheek is lighting up. So we get that nice result because we have the 3D model from facetracker. So that's how we went about doing that. The model's there so you can use it. Now I'm going to talk about the Smart Vector part briefly, just how we can go about creating it, and then I'll talk more in detail a little bit on how we can extend it, like I was showing in the draw over. So if we look a little bit closer on the smart vectors and how this is done, so there's actually two ways we can do this in terms of kind of extending smart vectors. I'm going to explain both ways. I actually used both methods in this particular shot because I was getting different results. So basically, yeah, so the smart vector has a little setting here called Inpaint Matte Region. And if we take a look at in the smart vector, if we view it and switch to the smart vector channel, and if we turn that on and off, we can actually see that it's kind of extending the tracking data from the smart vector. So all of this stuff down here, all these colors, it's basically telling the image how to move in X and Y. So these are kind of the vectors it's generating, and it's telling the direction in which to kind of, stick the pixels. And so you can plug in a matte here. So I have a roto basically around, again, the chin area, like we said, where it's kind of overlapping. So basically I just want to use the tracking data from down here and kind of extend it under. And that will basically just keep it so it's kind of all sticking on the neck if we want to add details under the chin, which is what we do want to do. So that's kind of how you can do it. You just basically go in Smart Vector, make sure you check that on, check to make sure you have a matte, and then you can adjust the matte dilation, which will kind of just erode it in and out. So you can kind of adjust where that starts to happen. So that's the first way you can do it. The other way you can do it, whoops, let me close this. So the other way you can do it is if you want a little bit more control than that, essentially what you can do is render out your smart vector like normal, plug it into a vector distort. So again, if you guys aren't familiar with smart vectors, just type it in, you'll find videos on how to just the basics of it. But if we go to the vector distort, you can output a ST map. So if we switch back to normal and just close this stuff, give it a second to load, and it will take a second. So we have our normal ST map, and if you see these colors, it's because the blue channel is solid. So it's not the normal red and green, but actually it's just because there's an extra blue channel, but that doesn't really do anything. So for example, you could just get rid of the blue channel, and it's going to look like a familiar pattern here. So it really is just creating, so if you see this and you're like, well, why is it not the red and green? It's just creating a blue channel, which gives us the perception of kind of these different colors here. But it's the same as the normal one, which is like this. So we have this result, but by actually using an Inpaint node and a roto node separately, rather than doing it through the Smart Vector node, we actually have a little bit more control. So you can do that same technique of rotoscoping something and extending it directly on these coordinate patterns, I suppose. So I'll show you exactly how I did it. Down here, I used basically another smart vector, and some of the edges were causing problems with the effects area. So if I just go to the comp and I show it, if we go in on this area here, and if I turn that off, I'll just turn it off real quick so you can see. So here's the little Inpaint node with a roto. So I actually rotoed on the edge of this. If I turn it off and just let it load for a second, you'll see that we can see these pixels stretching. So really all the way around I was getting the stretching on the edge. And by just doing the roto and kind of doing Inpaint, you can extend, and you see that now it's not stretching anymore. So what's great about the Inpaint node is you can go in here, and so you just plug in a source and a matte, and basically the way it works is it just kind of the same idea. It kind of pushes the pixels. So I would play around with that, play around with the settings. Really, it's very straightforward. You have a direction and an amount, and it's just saying the amount is kind of how far it's pulling that color, and the direction is the direction that it's going in. And so that's why it's kind of nice to do this separately rather than doing it all through the Smart Vector node, because you can actually control the direction. If you watch these little lines here, it's kind of hard to see, but you can kind of see you have a little bit more control over that, and you can kind of control like smoothness and stuff like that. So you just have a couple more sliders to play with in terms of like getting that edge to look really good. So there's also tutorials on that on YouTube if you need like a really in-depth, like every single slider. But rather than focus on every slider, I think it's more important to focus on the methods and where to use these type of things. So that's kind of how you can approach it. If you're doing the project, you know, you can try to do 2 different versions. So basically what I did, I just ran out a smart vector with no, I think I ran out of smart vector with basically no matte plugged in, just like straight up, almost default settings, high detail, and you just run it out. And then you can just start sticking stuff on and then see where the problems start to occur, which is why I saw the chin, I saw the edge here. So I think I used that default render and started to just fix that one in the UV coordinate texture rather than going back and fixing it through this. So one thing to keep in mind is the same rules apply to these UV coordinates. When you render these out, so if I go to the vector store, so basically you render out the smart vector, it gives you this, run it through the vector store, which gives you, you know, basically this with different colors. And you can pre-comp this again, so you can save this out as just a picture, and that's going to make your sticking stuff really fast. So if you were to write this out and save it, making sure you set 32-bit, which is explained in my other tutorials, you're going to get that basically sticking, and now you can just put all your textures on and not think about the tracking at all. So you can just go straight into the creative. So that's why I like to do this at the start of the project. Just set up all your tracking, do your face, do your body area, and then you can just go straight to the creative. So we have this plugging in here, and then you can see I'm doing a bunch of ST maps. So basically I'm just taking a bunch of pictures, effects, and sticking them through that ST map. And so if we just go up here, yeah, so that's pretty much it for the tracking. So if you guys are looking at this, kind of get the Smart Vector Track, 3D's done for you. So now we're going to start talking about the 2.5D enhancement. So just my general workflow for that part. And then I'll start kind of going into the 3D stuff after that. So talking about some of the 2D textures. So basically, yeah, if we start going to the cracks now, so we have all our tracking, we can use our smart vectors to basically stick stuff. Always keep in mind your reference frame for your smart vectors. So that's the frame that you decided, that's where you're going to line everything up on. So keep that in mind. So most of this stuff is just color integration now. So it's kind of, you know, just color corrections and stuff like that. But there is one specific trick that I'll kind of show you guys that really helps, especially with, you know, lighting that is changing. So we can see here, I just took a picture and kind of another picture, another angle. I've provided you guys some textures, and I've kind of just rotoscoped some pieces, do some little chunks, paying close attention to the edge. You see that I'm not just doing, you know, if I delete all these little pieces here, that would be very CG looking. You know, you want to break up those edges and try to get something that look organic. So then I do some stenciling kind of noise patterns and maybe stenciling some rotos, and then basically just sticking that image on in different areas. So you can see that's kind of adding some of these pieces here. But one thing I did that is a very useful technique, it will save you a lot of time, is we take the original picture. So we have some, let me just disable this so I can actually show it over the final here. So we have like this picture, which I've kind of, you can see done the same thing. I've kind of just masked it and cut it up. But you can see the lighting doesn't really match. I've kind of done some general grays to just get it roughly in place, but then I kind of left it there. So one thing you can actually do is basically it's similar to our frequency separation. So I have a video on that. And I'm going to do this technique a couple times in the video. So if you haven't seen the video on frequency separation, you can go to the channel and find it. But basically you want to separate out the detail from this original footage, and rather than using the detail, we're just going to use the general lighting and kind of apply it to these textures that we're kind of sticking on. So essentially what we can do is just blur the picture and multiply that onto our texture. So you see that it's grabbing the colors and it's grabbing the luminance from the picture, and we're just multiplying that on. And then when we stick that texture back on, we're saving ourselves a lot of time in terms of color integration. So I'm not having to go here and roto and darken this area and roto and brighten this area. It's already grabbing the colors and doing that for us. And what's great about this is it's dynamic. So as this warps and rotates, this is going to adjust in luminosity across time. So, you know, it's going to change with the picture basically. And we could go in here and make some slight adjustments to make this a little bit better. You see, maybe it's a little bit too bright here, and maybe we could go slightly darker here. So we could still do some little manual tweaks. I didn't do any more tweaks after this because, you know, in the final comp, you're not really seeing it anyway because, you know, it's there's a bunch of effects and stuff. So I was happy with that level of integration. But if you really want to be picky about it, you know, we could probably improve this a tiny bit. But in general, just getting those technique, or using that technique rather, is going to help you a lot because you can see it just makes everything sit together. And maybe sometimes you don't want to grab the skin tones that are underneath. So what you can do if you just want the luminosity is just to desaturate that kind of incoming image and just go like this. You can just pull the saturation down a bit and you're still getting the lighting, but you're not getting the colors. So maybe you're trying to apply something that's a slightly different material. So you wouldn't want to grab the skin tones, but you still want that luminance that's coming from over here. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's how we can use kind of the frequency separation in a different way to grab lighting from, or rather integrate pictures into an image. And then so something like this. So basically the same concept, you know, taking some pictures of cracks, just doing some contrast and so you can see it. Some of this is manual work I did with grades. So when I'm sticking this over, let's just disable all of this stuff for a second. If you give it a second to load. All right, so if we disable all that, yeah, that's what it looks like basically straight over. So obviously not matching at all. So some of the color corrections I did were just darkening. And sometimes with this luminance trick, obviously we got some really nasty dark edges after that, but sometimes with this luminance trick, you need to, I'll do the luminance trick and I'll put a grade before and kind of counter it to just kind of bring the values back up. But here it's obviously all over the place. So obviously some of these other corrections kind of balance that out. But you see that it just gives us a nice starting place to do stuff like that. So yeah, so that's kind of what we did there. Like I said, you could probably blend this a little bit further. Like I'm looking at it now, it's like, okay, well that looks a little bit too blurry. But usually I design a shot for the final comp. I don't design it for each step along the way. You know, I only care about the final image. I don't really care about, you know, if every single thing is like perfect along the way. So if you can see it, you can see it. If you can't, my opinion, you know, don't waste your time on it. So that's kind of how I approach it. So the next part we can talk about is this same process, but we're going to talk about it in terms of using some of those techniques on the 3D. So I'll talk about the 2.5D first. So I'm not going to talk about the effects in this video. That will come in part 3. So I'm going to skip down here to where we start to get to the face. So we'll work backwards to do the energy cracks in the next video. Yeah, I think but basically a good way to approach this is at least get all your textures in there. So if you're doing the project, get all your textures, make sure everything's sticking, and then we'll be able to integrate the cracks later on. So yeah, we'll talk about the 2.5D cracks first because that's easier, and then we'll talk about the 3D cracks last. So 2.5D cracks. So basically, this is easier to do in UV space because we can work flat and we can do some tricks with that frequency separation like I just showed you. So by working UV space, we're going to do some really awesome stuff with that. So if we flatten out our face, same as the last tutorial I posted, you can find that video as well. We take our picture, we project it onto the model, and then we render it out into a square format in UV space. So now we have a flattened face model. And this actually moves with the video. So if I kind of scrub through, you'll see that this face is stabilized, but the lighting is not. So this is really key. So you can see that the lighting moves. If I just give it a second to cache a couple frames here so I can show it easier. So we see 250, here's the lighting, 300, here's the lighting, and then we can go to the very end and see the lighting changing. You see everything is sticking except the lighting because we've stabilized the face. So if we hop through, we can see that the lighting is moving independently, which is really awesome because now what we can do is just integrate our textures onto one frame and use that moving lighting to kind of do that same sort of effect. So if we go down here, basically what I did was I have the face here and I merge the texture over. So let's give it a second here. I think I didn't actually use this texture in the end. I think I merged a different texture over it. So I was just merging a couple different layers of texture. So I've kind of provided you guys those images that you can take and kind of place in there. But again, I'm doing the same type of thing. So I'm taking a base integration, which is this, and then I'm doing that kind of trick to take that flattened face, do a slight correction maybe to the brightness, but then we're just multiplying it on. And also just to mention, in the multiply, you want to make sure to usually just output RGB. It looks like I did RGB on this one, but usually you just want to switch the output to RGB. So we don't want to affect the alpha. We're really just trying to affect the color. So that might have been a little mistake that I just left RGBA, but it doesn't look like it really made a difference. But you can see the difference. It just sits in. And what's great about this is by doing it this way, instead of just starting with this picture, rotoscoping where the light is and doing the corrections, this is going to change with the picture. So if I turn it on and I switch frames to the very end, you'll notice that triangle of light that's moving across the cheek is actually affecting our new CG textures. So if we just continue down here, the same concept applies. So we can see I actually covered up some of those textures with a better looking texture. I just thought that the scale looked better and it's more interesting. The cracks are a little bit wider, so just design wise, we can kind of run our effects through and see them a bit better. So I thought that was just a creative choice there. But same concept, right? So I kind of did a base integration to this level and then basically just blurring the picture and then kind of multiplying it on. So you see that that's kind of what it does. By blurring it, we're just getting the lighting, we're getting rid of all the detail. And that blurred picture we can just use as like a light map, essentially. And it looks like I did some very small tweaks to that map here, but again, those are just like normal things. If you see something is a little bit too bright, it's not going to give you a 100% perfect solution, right? But it will give you a very good one, and it's going to do the animation for you. So if you see little things are a little bit too bright, a little bit too dark, you can kind of just go tweak them. And again, I didn't run the whole picture back through as a projection. So what I normally do is I work on it in this flat space, and then I go back and I delete basically the picture, or either just kind of disconnect it. So the reason I do that is because I only want to take the cracks or the changes I did, and that's all I want to output through that scanline render. So when I'm done with it, this will be your final layer. And if you hit play on this, you'll see that it's like the CG cracks by themselves with the lighting moving on it. So that's basically how you do it. And you just merge this over like a normal picture, and that's basically it. So we can merge this over. So we have something like this, and we have like CG cracks with lighting. So that's the 2D solution, 2.5D, I guess. But you can see now, if we look at some areas here, this looks a little bit bumpier. We have some specular highlights, and some of this stuff looks more 3D. So now I'm going to go into talking about how we can do that, which is a little bit more complicated than what we just did. But fundamentally, it's the same idea. So we'll go up to that area. And you'll notice something I'm doing, the way I'm structuring this script is I have my main B pipe going straight down, all the layers going into it. But you'll notice I have this chain off to the left here, and this is my UV face. And the reason I'm doing that is because there's a lot of layers relying on that light map that I create. So I'm creating that face and then I'm just blurring it out and then using that same texture for kind of color correcting all the new textures that I'm applying. And I don't want to copy and paste that 100 times. So that's why I keep it off to the left. And every time I need that kind of light texture, I can just grab it from the left and kind of pipe it into what I'm doing over in different areas. So this is the 3D part now. So we have basically just more cracks, different textures, stuff like this. We do some color corrections. We scale it down. We do the normal stuff. And then we do our kind of lighting effect here. But then we start to go into using displacement. So essentially what we can do is we can create a height map from this. And we can use this, especially it's just black and white and cracks the darkest part. So it actually works really well for this type of effect. So what I did was before I ran this effect out, like this could be the 2D effect. You could run it straight out and it's exactly what we just did. But instead of doing that, what you can do is create a black and white alpha. So if you look at the alpha here, yeah, so actually we did like a key. So I did some color corrections on it and I did a luminance key. So I tried to create an alpha that's you have to think of it in 3D, right? So the white parts are going to be pushed out more, the black parts won't be pushed out. And I kind of frame holded that because we don't want it to move. We're in UV space, so we don't want it to move. And we can use this as a displacement map. So now if I plug that into a geo, using a displaced geo, so we have our head and then we have a displaced geo. We'll give that a second. Displacement takes a while, so it can be kind of a heavy thing, especially to render out. It will definitely take a little bit of time. You probably have to walk away for 20 minutes or something unless you have a render farm. But if we go in 3D, you can see it's calculating. And maybe I won't let this calculate if it takes forever. Because I have a feeling it's going to take a while. Okay, so actually it's going there. So we'll give it a second. Usually I try not to look at this in 3D space because it kind of just slows everything down. But maybe for this tutorial, if it'll actually load. But usually when you're dealing with displacement, yeah, best to just stay out of 3D if you can. But okay, so if we can zoom in here, at least we get some kind of representation of what's actually happening. And let's just try to see. So you can actually see that this is 3D. So we're actually creating 3D cracks on the face, which is giving us a little bit of parallax in the cracks. We're going to get these bumps coming out of the cheek. And that's just going to give us a slightly higher result, higher quality result. So we get a slight bump coming out just to make it feel more texture. And something else I did was I took that same head. So basically I provided two heads, you guys. I provided one just straight out of Keentools that can be used. But then there's another one that comes with a transform geo. And basically you just want to keep these two together like this. You want to keep them together. You can place the displacement in between. But as long as you keep those together, it'll be fine. But basically the only difference of this model is it's subdivided. Which means there's a lot more resolution so that these displaced geos will give us nice edges and nice quality. So you need a higher resolution model to do a good displacement. So I basically just went in Maya and subdivided it. Very simple. You can do it in Blender as well. You basically just go in and use a smooth modifier on your geometry. Same exact concept. So I did the same thing here, but I took the same model, displaced it with the same map, but I rendered out of array render with a ambient occlusion shader, which gives us this map. And this might be a little bit too much displacement relative to the other one. Let me see. I think this one looks like it's a bit more. Yeah, it looks like I might have actually displaced this one a little bit too much, but no big deal. We can kind of, it looks like I just graded it up a little bit. A slight blur, and that's just going to give us some nicer shadows to make it look a little bit more 3D. So we can kind of multiply that over. So what I normally do with the ambient occlusion is I merge it over a white constant. So you get it on white, and then you can just simply multiply this over your image at the end. So now we have like contact shadows in the cracks that we displaced. So I did that same technique, I think 3 times on this shot. I have one on the forehead, one on the left side, but they're all using the same method here. Right, so we have that, and we also, if I enable and disable the ambient occlusion, you see we just get some slight cracks and stuff like that. We could adjust it more and perfect further, but I think I'm happy with the result in terms of for what I'm using it for. That's the thing, right? Like these shots, you can spend infinite amount of time. I could give myself still 20 or 30 notes on this if I wanted to just keep pushing it. But in general, you just have to decide when to stop on something. But really, like notes you can give endlessly. So I think that's just something to think about as well. It's like, what level of detail are you working for? Are you working for film? Are you working for TV? In this case, I'm doing it for YouTube. So yeah, more cracks, same concept. So that's pretty much it for the displacement 3D part. Hopefully you guys understand it. Again, if you guys are doing the project file, you have email support, so you can shoot me a question and I'll help you out if you get stuck on something, if the video is not clear. So the last thing I want to talk about, what is the last thing here? We had the crack mats. So one thing before we move into part 3 is we want to create some crack mats. So basically alphas that represent where all the cracks are. So basically once you've placed all your CG cracks on your face, now we need to create an alpha basically where all of those cracks are. And one way to do this is actually sort of like frequency separation again. So we have this, if we go back to our flattened head and just give it a second. Actually, you know what? I think I shuffled it dark. Let's just see here. So I have the flat head, and then I merged the changes over. So I merged our CG over it. So I basically put this off into its own little stream here, and I wanted to create an alpha that represents where all the cracks are. Now immediately, you can see, hopefully, luminance key is not going to work for this because we have shadows, we have highlights. A luma key is not going to pull out the cracks. But if we do frequency separation, it can. So if we blur the picture and we divide it, you see that we've kind of isolated the cracks very quickly. So what you can do from that is do a luminance key, and then we basically have an alpha that represents our cracks without having to trace over 100 cracks and spend hours trying to do that. So that would not be a very efficient way to create that type of alpha. Frequency separation, I think, is probably the only way you're going to do it. So knowing that technique is going to save you a lot of time right here. So once you have that, I kind of just remasked it by the head. So we have something that looks like this. And then ultimately, I kind of just output it through a scanline render at the end there. And so maybe some of these little things were little tweaks in terms of where the cracks appear. So I did some slight adjustments to the mat, like maybe, we didn't want the frequency separation happening in the eyes. We didn't want that as part of that alpha, so I kind of just stencil out some pieces and kind of go about it like that. But you'll see later on in the next video, we'll use that to kind of basically mask some of the effects. So one thing that probably some people are going to get confused on, this is the part of the tutorial I think people will probably most likely get confused on, is this area. So part of the crack mat that's a little bit tricky is the 3D displacement crack mats, because if we just simply keep it in 2D, like for example here, we're working in UV space, in the flattened space, and we did our creating that alpha, that all makes sense. But what about the cracks that we displaced the model in 3D? This technique doesn't work completely because the position changes after the displacement is applied. So a better way to explain that, if I go up to it and look, so if I were to just go into 2D version where I did this, these cracks. So basically I was kind of, let's just go here. I was doing the same thing. I was basically just, let's just create an alpha so I can explain this easily. Let's see here. Yeah, so we have our cracks, and basically I was kind of lining those up with, yeah, let me just put an alpha here. Okay. So the way I kind of did it was I was merging it here. Oh, that's why. It's mixed half. There we go. So that's kind of where I'm pulling in from the left. So I have that flattened face. I keep pulling it in and then add my new stuff. And then I just will use this as a reference as to where these cracks are going to appear. See that this is not actually connected to anything. So I'm using it as a reference. But one problem with that is if we were to just do the same frequency separation to get that alpha, the position changes in 3D. So because it's displacing, these cracks and everything is kind of being pushed around. So actually what you need to do is to create a new channel. So this is kind of advanced, but I have a video about the shuffle node. I think at the end of it, I talk about this specific thing where you can kind of store channels in these. You can create layers and kind of store them in here. So essentially what I did to solve this problem was I did a luminance key of the cracks, which is giving us kind of the alpha that we're going to want later on. And I shuffled it in as a new channel. So if you open the shuffle node, you can see how it's set up. So I have RGBA, and then I created a new channel called crack matte. So to create a new channel, you can go there and hit new, and you just kind of hit OK, and you'll get all these channels here. And after this node, you'll see that we actually have a new layer here stored, just like the alpha is stored here. So that's pretty useful because now if we just go to the end here and we run it through the scanline render just like normal, making sure to check channels to all. So you want to render all the channels. If we go here to the result and then we look, we'll still have that stored here. So if I switch to that layer, you'll see we actually have that alpha stored. So that's one way to do it. And the difference and the reason we have to do it that way is because this displacement is actually affecting this layer. So if I go to this scanline render and just show you guys, so I'll give it a second here. So this is probably where people will get confused. You don't have to do this if you don't want to do the 3D displacement. That's up to you. But yeah, I assume this is probably where people get confused because especially beginners, when you're doing like shuffle and stuff like that and creating layers, it's kind of an organization thing. And if you don't fully understand the concept, it's kind of confusing. But once you grasp that concept, and that's why I recommend you go check out that shuffle video, it helps understand why we're doing it. And it's not the only time you'll have to do this. Sometimes you'll have to create a layer before you run it out of scanline. It's a very common thing once you start to get into more advanced compositing. So, okay, let me just disable the displace to show you. So you see that this alpha is actually slightly changing because of this displacement. So that's why we need to do it this way. Because otherwise these cracks, they won't line up with the main layer, which is this layer. They won't line up. They'll be kind of flat because we're pushing them around. And so hopefully that makes sense. And then basically what you do is you take this layer and you will go combine it with the full crack matte. So we have like this one that we created, and then we add over the cracks that are 3D displaced. So basically like that. And you see I did some weird shuffling here, and basically all I'm doing is shuffling out the crack matte layer. So if you've done CG compositing, it's the same thing. It's like when you have a CG EXR, you shuffle it out. So you're shuffling out that layer. And then all I did was kind of put the alpha into all the color channels just so I could see it. It's just nice to see. And then what I did was copy the original alpha of this texture into this layer and pre-multiply it. So now we have just the cracks with a solid alpha. And by doing it this way, we can merge this over our final kind of crack matte alpha. So that's kind of advanced stuff, but hopefully that makes sense. And yeah, so in part 3, we'll be ready. If you get to this point and you can get these created, you'll be ready to start putting the effects through, which will be the whole next part where I'll explain you know, how I went about creating these patterns and flowing them through the face. We'll do some other advanced stuff as well, which is animating some roto strokes. So I animated a bunch of roto strokes on the 3D face to kind of draw the path. So if I actually look at this and I hit play, you'll see some of these roto strokes. They're actually like drawing up the face. And that will like reveal the effects that we create. So that will all be in the next video, but I think that's good for this video, and you guys will have a lot to work on in the meantime. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed, and if you're not already subscribed, you know, subscribe if you like this kind of stuff, and hit like if you found it useful. That's pretty much it.